You must be interested in WordPress security, or else you wouldn't be watching this. Hi, my name is William Beem from Suburbia Press, and I'm glad you're here. I am going to talk about a number of things with WordPress security, what happens to you when somebody attacks, why they attack, what you can do to mitigate that risk, and a number of other things that I hope you'll find interesting and helpful to protect your website and all of your resources. But before I get into that, I just want to share a couple of things, and that is that I have a free ebook for you. It is the top 10 questions about a high converting website. And in fact, one of the questions in there is whether WordPress security is important or not. And just a hint, it is, or else I wouldn't be doing this video. You can find it at this website, suburbiapress.com/questions. And there is a link in the description below, so you don't have to remember that. If you just take a look at the description, you'll find it. All right. With that said, let me get on into it. So here's the joy of WordPress security. We're going to start off with a little overview and why do they attack us? And for some of them, the answer is quite simply, it's fun, but most of them have a bit more intent for what they're trying to do for their business. We're going to go over some security concepts. We're going to talk about a few things that I brought up in the security concepts or will bring up. It's like how you identify where they're going to attack you, how you reduce the number of places they can attack you, how you make it harder for them to attack you, and how you raise the cost of an attack. And then we'll talk briefly about some WordPress security plugins, and I've got a recommendation for you there. All right, so let's start with why do they attack us? And there are a few reasons that they have. So one is just to deface your website. There are, I hate to call them this, but it's almost think of like internet gangs. They just go around tagging sites, and it's kind of a competition for them. Say who can break into this site and put their name or deface it somehow. And that is a competition that, like I said, some people just do it for fun, or it's a source of pride that I've been able to break into these sites. And here's my mark as proof that I did it. Data theft is a big reason. Most WordPress websites have some kind of data, even if it's only the user login data, they can get that information and then find out where else they can use that. They could use it to take over your site to send out email spam or phishing attacks on other people. So if they set up their own site to do that, they're easily shut down. But if they have bots that go off and attack a number of sites and then they put on their scripts, then they can send off their phishing attacks and their spam advertisements from a number of websites, and it never comes back to them. So SEO spam, instead of emailing spam, this is where they use search engine optimization and hidden backlinks to other sites. So they want to rank a site and they can't get a backlink from your site in a traditional way. The black hat way is to break into your site and put their backlinks in your articles. And that can have an adverse effect on your search engine optimization. They may want to distribute malware to your visitors. And if you think about some of those things like, crypto ads where they want you to send money to their Bitcoin wallet because they've got some goods on you. I get these emails every once in a while claiming things that I know are untrue, and they've taken over my site and they've taken over my email account, whatever else. And in my case, I know the stuff's not true because what they're sending is repeated over and over again. But they can actually lock up someone else's computer who's come in there because of the malware on your server. And then they can kind of threaten them or coerce them into paying them money to release their information or whatever it is that they've done. Botnets and denial of service attacks, basically that's a way that they can take down competition, for example. Or the botnets are just more soldiers in their little automated army to fight and to break into other websites. So it's kind of a growing thing. It's like you can knock somebody down or you can take over their site, grow your network, and your website could be working as part of a network that you don't even know about. And then, of course, monetization. They put their ads on your website. So when people come to your pages and they see these ads and you get views, they'll make money from websites where they didn't have to do any work, but you did. And like I said, some people just do it for fun. So that's kind of the way hacking started off, is people wanted to see what they could do, and some people still do that. All right, so let's talk about a few security concepts. And I'm going to talk briefly about myself. I usually don't like to do this, but since we're talking about security and it is an important subject, I want you to know what my experience is. So I am a certified information systems security professional, and you can see the acronym, it's pronounced CISSP. But basically, that is a high value certification that people in the IT industry have. So they kind of demonstrates that they've studied, they understand, and they work with security information systems, and they work with protecting that. So I got mine back in 2017, 2018, something like that. And I've been working with information systems and stuff like this since 82 or 83, but particularly with security within the past decade. So I finally got certified when I was at PwC a few years ago. So I have a lot of experience with identity and access management. That is specifically what I did at PwC. It is also specifically what I did at Lockheed Martin. And it was aspects of what I did for banks and for other organizations that I've worked for. And when I was a director of IT for some educational facilities, of course, that was part of the overall goal as well. So I've got a lot of experience with identity and access management and security in general. So as I mentioned, there's a few of the companies I've worked for: Lockheed Martin, PwC, Lucent Technologies, which broke off of Bell Labs, and General Mills. It was kind of where I got my start in mainframes and working security from there. So as I said, IT experience since 1982. Basically, I've been around the block with a lot of Fortune 100 companies and find out how they get attacked, what they do to mitigate those attacks, and it's a constant process of looking and see what's next. You're never done with security. And I've been in WordPress blogging since 2003. I got my first domain a few years before that, and I was using Microsoft Front Page. But as far as WordPress, when it came out, I switched over and started working with it. And it's certainly grown and improved quite a bit, but there's also still a lot of holes and bugs. And that's why I'm doing this video. So I wanted to put this thought in your head. There is no such thing as being completely secure. You are never 100% secure, and things are constantly changing, and there are always new threats. So you can mitigate most of the risks. And that's just what I wanted to share there. You can mitigate the risk, and you can get yourself to a pretty comfortable state, but it's never going to be perfect. And my own security is never going to be perfect. Your security is never going to be perfect, but you can make yourself a much harder target than most of the sites out there. And I'm going to show you why that's very important. All right, so this part where it says the 4 pillars of security, this came from someone I worked for at PwC. His name was James Shira. He was, at the time when he first brought this up, the Chief Information Security Officer. Then he got to be the Chief Information Officer. And quite honestly, I didn't like working for the man, but I did like this concept. He put this out there, and in his mind, he says he read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and he came up with this based on what he read. Well, I've read the same book, and I understand the concepts there. And he came out when he did his presentation for this, said, "We are at war." I mean, that was his opening statement. And I thought it was a little bit of hyperbole, but there is a bit of truth to it. There is a little kind of hidden battle that a lot of people don't know about between attackers and website owners. So he came up with what he called the 4 pillars. I kind of think of them more as stepping stones because one builds on the next. So the first one is identify the attack surface. You have to know all of the places where you could be attacked, because if you don't know that, you don't know where the attack's going to come from. So think about this in a corporate environment. We would think about what are the internal attacks, like disgruntled employees might have. What are the edge attacks, people who might be coming in through our network, and what are the external attacks? They're probably going to be trying to come in through the network, but they're also going to be trying phishing attacks and so forth. There are a lot of different aspects of where you can be attacked, and you need to know where all of those places are before you can do anything about it, or even recognize that you've been attacked. So the next thing you do is you reduce the attack surface. In other words, you look at all of these things that you've identified. You're basically doing an inventory in the first step of where can I be attacked? And then you're saying, well, how can I eliminate some of those possibilities? Do I really need every place where there's an opportunity to attack me? And the answer is almost always, yes, you can eliminate some of that. You don't need everything. And WordPress is no different. We're going to talk about the places where you can be attacked and how you can mitigate that, or how you can reduce that attack surface. The next thing is to harden the attack surface. So if you can't eliminate something, can you make it harder for them to penetrate that barrier to get into your WordPress site, to get into your business? Whatever it is that you're trying to secure, you want to make it harder for them to do it. And the final step is to raise the cost of an attack. And this is, I think, one of the best examples here. I mean, all of these work, but raising the cost of the attack means that you're a less ideal target for someone to attack. They want the easy targets. They want to break in and do what they want to do without spending much effort. If they really have to work to attack you, well, there are other sites that are going to be easier to attack. They'll probably move on to something else unless they really want you for some reason that they work harder. But think how many of those little botnet and bot attacks you're going to eliminate just by following these 4 pillars or these 4 steps to protect yourself. So let's start with number 1, identify the attack surface. We're going to talk about some of the vulnerabilities that are inside WordPress. So obviously the first one is going to be brute force attacks. So this is where somebody's coming to your site and they're trying to guess an ID and guess a password. And it is the most common and it is the least effective. Here's why it's the most common. A lot of people don't pay any attention to their security at all, and they don't even bother changing the default user ID and password that WordPress comes up with, which, by the way, it is the user ID is admin and the password is admin. If nobody changes that, anybody who knows that stuff can get in right away. There are also some very common user IDs that they find. Support is one. I've seen people attack me with admin W and webmaster, for example. So there are a number of common names that they will try to, and then see if they can guess. And the passwords are laughingly pathetic that some people use. There are people who will use the word password for their password, or they'll use pass123, or they'll do 123 password, something that is easy to guess and has no thought into it. And also, when these brute force attacks happen, they've got a library of successful passwords and user IDs, and the bot is just kind of rotating through them to see if they can get in easily. So the attacker tries to guess a user ID and password to gain access to your site. So obviously, this is the least effective because I'd say most people know enough these days to change the default password and default account. But we're going to talk about what you can do there. The next one I want to bring up is SQL injection. So SQL injection, this is an attack that takes advantage of sloppy input opportunities that use a backend SQL database. So WordPress uses a backend SQL database. When I say sloppy input, think about it. If you have fields on your, like a form on your website, and you ask for a phone number, but you don't say that field only accepts numbers, it can accept characters as well. Well, that's an opportunity for them to inject something into that field because they know that field goes to a database behind the form. So they will attack forms. If you have site searches, they'll attack that. WordPress also allows URL parameters. In other words, there are extensions of things they can add on to the URL that will also perform actions. And that's been known to allow people to take over a site completely based upon either SQL injections or sometimes some of the other problems we're going to talk about. So the attack uses malicious input. In other words, they're not filling out the form the way you think that they should, that you've expected them to. They're putting in all sorts of things that you never planned or thought about. So that input is not designed as where you say first name. Well, if they can put anything they want there, including some SQL code, and they can break your site and get into it that way, they will do it. So SQL query manipulation allows an attacker to inject their own SQL code. And once they can inject code into your SQL database, well, then they have command capability. So they can tell that SQL database what to do. And since a big part of what WordPress is driven by SQL, that is a very powerful tool. And it also enables some other types of attacks. And you're going to see some of these types of attacks that we talk about can work in conjunction with each other. So the code bypasses authentication and operates with all access. Remember, we talked about passwords and user IDs. Well, they don't have to have a user ID or password if they can inject something into a form on your website, and then the SQL engine says, okay, you're in. So sloppy SQL code and sloppy form preparation or sanitization allows an attacker to inject something through those forms or even through your URL to accept commands, and then they can take over that way. And that allows them in the end, they can extract data, they can manipulate the data. So instead of extracting it, maybe they change it. They have unauthorized access to your site. So it gives them things. And think about what kind of data you have. Do you have credit card data? Do you have username data with their email address and other information about them? And one of the things I always tell people is never collect more data than you need because you are responsible or liable for that data. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is cross-site scripting. And this is similar to SQL injection, but it uses JavaScript on vulnerable fields. So instead of going after the SQL engine, it's going after your visitor's browser. So it impacts your site visitors because it can operate on their browser. Browsers work on JavaScript. They'll accept JavaScript commands. So instead of going after all the data on your site, they might be monitoring passwords or credit card numbers that your visitors are putting into your site. So it loads in the browser to execute the script. It may steal cookies. It may steal the form input, like I said, whatever they're putting into a form, or some other sensitive data from a visitor. I mean, once they're in their browser, who knows what else they can get to. So your site may not be the source where they're getting the data, but your visitors are being compromised, and that's going to end up causing you problems as well. It does all the nasty things that SQL injection can do. So as far as like taking over your site, if they've got the browser, then they might be able to use the browser to input things into those fields as well. All right, now another way is to use files, file inclusion. And there's a couple of names that seem like they're the same thing, but they're a little bit different. So local file inclusion forces the server to execute files. Remote file inclusion makes your server retrieve, not retriever, I'm talking about my dogs, makes your server retrieve malicious files. In other words, they've got access into your server and they're getting it to download files to your server that they're going to put there so that they can access them and maybe execute some code. Arbitrary file inclusion executes files that are not intended for public use. So inside of WordPress, there are things that are executable for the backend, for the administrative side. They're not intended to serve pages up. So in other words, they can execute something that goes where a visitor can see it, or they can execute code behind the scenes and have it do things that maybe you did not intend it to do. So PHP wrappers. So PHP is the language that WordPress is built upon. They will use that to execute PHP scripts either by the HTTP protocol or an FTP protocol if you haven't locked down your FTP. So since your website has to be on HTTP and usually HTTPS for secure, if they can get those little wrappers around some code to come into your site, and that could be from a URL, it could be from a form on your site, then they can go ahead and execute code that you didn't previously have loaded on your site. Path traversal navigates beyond the site intended structure. So you're going to have parts of your directory on the server that you don't want people to look at. What they're going to do is if they can navigate a path on your server, they're going to put in some things that typically you wouldn't allow or are in error to see if they can get access to other paths for the back end part of your server, which could even go to your root operating system and see if they can break your website and get access to your server just by putting in paths that don't exist or go beyond the areas that you intended people to be able to navigate. This is a wonderful one, insecure file permissions. So attackers will scan for weak or sometimes incorrect file permissions. Every file that you have on a server, particularly most of these are going to be based on Linux or Unix or some variant of that form. Even Windows servers are going to have file permissions. So these permissions are whether you can read, whether you can write, or whether you can execute. So if you give all permissions to everybody, every file, then they can exploit that. And sometimes they will even find a way to upload a different file with the same name of what you have so that they get those permissions to execute. So weak file permissions allow them to gain unauthorized access. And with the access, here are a few things they can do. They can obviously read your files. They can delete replace or modify your files, and they can execute arbitrary code. When I say arbitrary, it means whatever they want, not necessarily what you intended. So there are things that are within WordPress that it needs to be able to do so you can administrate the service, but you don't want your visitors to be able to access. And then, of course, they can elevate their own permissions. So if they have a login on your account, maybe they're a subscriber, but by using some of the weaknesses that we'll discuss, they can change themselves from administrator to have, or excuse me, from a subscriber to have full administrator access. Another one is XML-RPC. So XML is a data structure. RPC means remote procedure call. And it's a way for third-party applications to interact with your WordPress website remotely. If you've ever heard of Jetpack, which is a service that came around from the company Automatic that created WordPress, they use XML-RPC to provide many of those services. So they can gather a list of usernames on your website using this. Those usernames can help them with brute force attacks because now you've taken away 50% of the problem. They know which username to put in, so all they have to do now is guess a password for those usernames. And as I said, they'll have a library or a database of common passwords that have worked for them in the past, and they'll just run through them with the same username. They can do a denial of service and flood messages to your website to overwhelm you. In other words, they're just being malicious. They want to take you down. Why? Who knows? Maybe it's fun, or maybe you're a competitor and they just want to screw you over for when the Google bot is going to come around and crawl your site. There's different reasons for wanting to do a denial of service. But with access, they can add their own posts, they can inject or distribute malware, they can gather data. Basically, they can do all the nasty things we've been talking about too. Once they've got access, XML-RPC is, for an attacker, a really cool way that you've kind of left the front door unlocked. And then we talked about PHP exploits. This is really something that kind of comes along with a lot of the other things where they get combined. So as I said, PHP is the server-side scripting language that WordPress uses. So it enables a few things. It enables remote code execution. And by remote, we're talking about somebody who's not logged into your site, but a service that's interacting with your site. It enables file inclusion, which we just talked about. It enables SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and file upload vulnerability. So PHP is really the cornerstone of what runs your site. So it is a very common way to attack your site and then run a lot of these other types of attacks that we talked about. So when we talk about attack services, those are the things we can talk about. But the other one, and this is one of my favorite ones, and it's probably the least costly one for a lot of people to use, is a Trojan horse. So if you know the story about the Trojan horse, this is where one side, built this large Trojan horse to put up at the gates of their enemy. And the enemy thought, oh, it's a gift. These people are nice. Let's bring it inside. Of course, inside the belly of the Trojan horse were all the warriors who, once they got past the walls that they couldn't defeat before, they kind of killed everybody from within. So the idea of a Trojan horse is something that you willingly bring onto your site and unknowingly has malicious intent inside of it. So this can happen when you install software. And you maybe thought this software is doing something for you, but it has an unintended action. This is my favorite story. This happened when I was at PwC. So in 2020, a company named SolarWinds, they are a monitoring firm. They're US based. They're in, I think, Oklahoma. And this was the biggest espionage event in IT history. So what happened was they put an agent on every server. The agent collects and gathers information and sends it back to a central reporting spot. So it could be on, maybe you've got your company where you've got a server where you put that information, but it could also send it back to SolarWinds. So it's very popular. It's used by United States government. It's used by foreign governments. It's used by corporations. Like I said, PwC had it. When I was at Lucent, it wasn't quite as popular. We used OpenView years ago back in that, but SolarWinds was coming around then. Lockheed Martin had it. And a lot of companies, big and small, use SolarWinds. If you've ever used the site called Pingdom Tools to test your WordPress site, that's put on by SolarWinds. So here's what happened. The Russian government had teams of people that added backdoor malware in an update to the SolarWinds agent software. How do they do that? Anybody who builds code often buys libraries from other sources, and they usually don't investigate those libraries very well. So SolarWinds, like any other developer, doesn't write every ounce of its code. It buys some code that they need. Well, the Russians said, hey, SolarWinds is using this. Let's write something in a library that they're going to use. And it got pushed out in the update. What SolarWinds didn't know, and neither did anybody else, was that there was malicious code in there. So this malware distributed privileged information from the servers in the government at all levels. I mean, we're talking Department of Homeland Security. We're talking State Department. I mean, all the bigwigs, as well as all the other levels of the United States government, because they were all in there. Banks had this software, schools, corporations, private firms. Every single one of them was an open door for the Russian government to go inside and collect whatever data they wanted, because this user agent had permission to everything on the server, because it was supposed to monitor everything on the server. It was trusted. It was welcomed inside the firewall. It was welcomed inside all the server defenses. And from there, it spied on everything and shot all of that information back to the United States government. When this happened at PwC, it is an understatement to tell you there was a big freak out. They shut down everything. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? And finally, they come around and tell us. The same thing had happened when I was at Lockheed Martin with a different software. And that was an RSA hack. You may not remember, but like these little authentication codes you get, well, it used to be on a little hardware device that would every so many seconds would give you a different code. Well, RSA also got hacked, and people figured out how to come up with the right code to put in from RSA. And when I was at Lockheed Martin, the same thing happened. It's like, you can't work from home today. You have to come in. I thought, okay, why? Can't talk to you about it. We have to come in. Well, then I found out later on. I don't know why they wouldn't tell me over the phone, but that's okay. People panic whenever there's an enormous security breach. And I want to tell you, when I worked for Lockheed Martin, they had outstanding IT security, as well as other security. PwC also has outstanding IT security. But a Trojan horse is the best way to bypass all this stuff. That's why phishing works. If somebody clicks on a link, they don't need to get your username and password. You're basically giving them access by bringing something into your site. And it's scary to think that you never know what's going to happen, but this is the most effective thing that can happen to you as far as an attack. So the next stage is, how do you reduce the attack surface? So here's a few opportunities for you. The first one I'm going to recommend, disable XML-RPC. If you're using Jetpack, there are a lot of better tools. Get rid of it. It's bloated. It's heavy. Disable XML-RPC. There are a lot of ways to do this. Some of your website hosts can do this for you. Some plugins can do this. A lot of security plugins will do this. There's another plugin I use called Perf Matters, and it will also do this for you. There's a little, just toggle it, and it's easy to do. Update your plugins. If you don't update your plugins and there is a known bug in there, people will scan sites looking to see what plugins you have, what theme you're using. And if they come back and say, oh, you're using plugin version number XYZ, and they know that there's a vulnerability, they will come attack you. So the scan happens first. They're looking for your weaknesses. The attack comes later when they find a possible vulnerability. So let me give you an example. There is a plugin for WordPress called Social Warfare. A few years ago, they had a weakness in their plugin that with a few commands at a URL action, if they could go get a list of all the usernames on your site, and then they could take any of those user accounts, even if they were just subscribers or didn't have any role at all, and elevate them to an administrator authority account. I remember seeing demos of this. They did it in less than 5 minutes, and that was because the person was taking her time explaining it slowly as she was demonstrating. So social warfare fixed that problem, but they got a really bad reputation at the time this happened, and a lot of people, myself included, moved away from them to something else. And it just shows that when there are old plugins that have known problems, people will scan your site and they will attack based upon those known problems. You want to use least privilege file permissions. In other words, what is the least privilege somebody needs in order to work on your site, particularly for their role. So you probably only want to have read permission in some cases. For some roles, you may not want to have any permission. So a visitor that doesn't log in your site, there are some things, obviously, you don't want them to get access to. You don't want them to even see them or know that they're there. Administrators are going to have more permissions, then down editors are going to have permissions, and subscribers are going to have different permissions. So these different levels of user inside of WordPress, you want to look at the permissions they have and what they can do. You definitely want to change the default admin password name, or as I would recommend, create it, another account, replace it, come up with a different name, and then delete the default admin account. Now, obviously, you want to come up with a new account, give it administrator authority so you can still log in. If you delete that admin account before you've created another administrative account, well, then you've just kind of screwed yourself over. So create another account and then delete admin. Get rid of it. That is the most common name that the attacker is going to search for. All right, so we want to talk about how do you harden the attack surface now. So there's a few points. Complex passwords. You've heard people harp on this over and over again. Don't use pass123. Get yourself a password manager. I use 1Password from, I forgot who it's from. There's Google has a password manager. LastPass is another one. And even some of these tools sometimes have security breaches, but get yourself a password manager. They will generate complex passwords for you, and then they will save them for you. Almost every browser out these days will save your user ID and password. So you don't have to remember that it's XJ79423, whatever. You want to have complex passwords, and you want them to be long, not a little 3, 4, 6 character password. You want 12 to 24 characters, something that you can't pronounce and you don't remember. And it's managed by either your browser's management or some other password manager. You want to limit the number of login attempts that someone can make. This is something, again, a lot of the security tools can do, but there are also plugins like limit logins for WordPress will do for you. So you don't want to give people that many times that they can try to log in and get it wrong. If they get it wrong a number of times, well, you want to lock them out. So you can't log into this account anymore for however many hours, days, whatever period you say. You want to use two-factor authentication. So remember I talked about that RSA token? Google Authenticator is one. I prefer one called Authy, A-U-T-H-Y. And the reason I prefer that over the Google Authenticator is because it works on mobile devices. There's also an app on Mac. There's an app for Windows. And that way, depending on where I am, these passwords can sync up with each other. And I don't necessarily have to pull out my phone to find the password. If I'm working on my desktop, it's easy to pull up the desktop app. So that is very good. It does essentially the same thing as the Google Authenticator does or the RSA token does. So use two-factor authentication. If you can, you may want to use biometric authentication. As of this moment, the only company I know that's doing this is iThemes Security. I used to use it. I don't anymore. And I hated giving up that one aspect of it where on my Mac, I've got this little Touch ID button. So the biometric authentication was I put my finger down there and it logged me into WordPress. Very convenient, very secure. I expect we're going to see more of this. We're talking about Passkeys. And another way you can do it there are USB plugins that'll have a place where your thumbprint or fingerprint can go. So you don't necessarily have to have a Mac. And you can have USB security keys. So those are different authentication factors you can use. So two-factor authentication is typically something you have and something you know. So you know your WordPress credentials, username and password, but something you have, well, that could be the token code. It could be your fingerprint if it works with Face ID, or it could be just another security token that goes in your USB port. So those are different things you can use. You want to block direct access to your PHP files. This is something that your web host can probably help you with. I use Cloudways, and they have a simple little toggle switch, block direct access to your PHP files. In other words, you have to be logged in on the server in order to access them. Only people who are elevated authority and have access that they've gotten into WordPress can access them. The system itself can access it. But somebody who's trying to come in from the outside and manipulate it through a URL or other things won't have access to it. You want to redirect. If you're still using HTTP, you want to automatically redirect any pages that are HTTP to HTTPS. The S is for secure. That means the page is encrypted end to end. So in other words, nobody else outside of the visitor and your website can see the communication that's going on. And this happens, let's say that you're on public Wi-Fi. Well, I can easily monitor whatever traffic is going on public Wi-Fi from my laptop. There's a number of apps that do that. And I use this all the time in my corporate IT job. So I could see what traffic was happening. And if you're using someone else's public Wi-Fi, you don't know what their router is capturing as your traffic goes back and forth. But if your traffic is encrypted on your computer and your browser, and it's sending to another website that can decrypt it, then anybody spying on the public Wi-Fi can't read it. Anybody who's got the router that can collect the data can't read it. So you want to use secure encrypted traffic at all times. So you may also want to use a web application firewall. There are some plugins for this. There are security plugins that will do this. There are also services, both Cloudways, my web host, and Cloudflare, which is where I have my DNS, can give you web application firewalls. And what they do is before something even gets into access your site, they have a database of known attackers, known basically problem children on the internet, and they'll just say, no, you're out of here. It's like having a bouncer at the door to the bar. They're not going to let in people that they find suspicious. And then I want to say, limit the number of user accounts on your server. Every account that you have could be elevated. And I mentioned that case with social warfare. It took basic accounts and elevated them to admin authority. This is why I don't want, at least on my blog site, I don't want to have user accounts there for people logging in for my support. I provide my support, people send an email to support, that generates a ticket on my side so I can manage it better than just trying to do it with email. And there's a way that I could set up a form that people could create an account on my site. I don't want that on that particular site. If I were going to create a support website, I would create a separate support website knowing that that's going to have data on it and working to protect that, but then it wouldn't have access to all the other things on my site that I'm using for my visibility, my marketing, or if I'm doing that for my membership. And those are things where I want to make sure I'm keeping that user data separate and secure from other places. So the number of accounts you have on your server, every account you have is a potential vulnerability. All right, let's talk about raising the cost of an attack. So here's how to do it. You want to limit known vulnerabilities. So if you have themes or plugins that are installed but they're not active, get rid of them. Even an unactive theme or an inactive plugin, I said unactive, that's brilliant. Anything that's inactive can still be used in an attack. If you're not using them, get rid of them. Install them when you need them, do what you need to do, and then get rid of them when you're done. So anything is going to be a problem. And the problem with inactive themes and plugins is that you typically don't update them. So if there's a known vulnerability and it can show up on a scan, then that's something that they can exploit. Even if you're not using it to power your site, it's still there. It's still a backdoor into your site. So when updates come out, you want to update your themes, your plugins, and your core WordPress files. I'm going to put a caveat on that. When there are major updates, I don't update right away because there are always bugs in major updates. So when WordPress 6.0 comes out, I don't update it until it's 6.01 or 6.02. WordPress 6.1 comes out, that's still might be a minor update. Instead of 6, it's 6.1. But I kind of wait a while for the bugs to get fleshed out and people to find what's going on. With themes and plugins, I typically do those right away, unless, again, it is a very major one. And depending upon the purpose of the plugin, I may not want to do it. Now, what you want to be able to do is roll back in case of a problem. Sometimes I would recommend have a test site where you update that first, see if there's any problems, monitor like known chat boards, forums, discussions to see if there's a problem with a particular update and be able to roll back. And also, the other problem with theme updates is sometimes that's how new security things or problems get introduced. It's because they updated something and they overlooked a problem. This can happen to any developer. It has happened to iThemes security. It's happened to Wordfence. It's happened to a lot of major plugins that I use and other people use. It can happen. That's why I say there is no such thing as complete and total security. The only way to completely secure your WordPress environment is to not have it connected to the internet and never ever let anyone other than yourself use it. And of course, what good is that? So I am recommending that you use a security plugin. Not only is it going to help you eliminate a lot of these threats and raise the cost of the attack, but it's also going to let you know what attacks are happening to you. And that helps to raise the cost of an attack because you can block those things off. Maybe you change a user account so it's not one of the ones that's on the common list. As I said, admin, that's one you want to get rid of right away. It could be that they're trying certain IP addresses. I had last month somebody who was really trying to hack into my Suburbia Press website, and I had like 137 attacks within an hour, and they were all coming from different IP addresses, but they were using the same username. So somebody clearly had a robot, and because I limit login attempts, after they tried it a few times, they got blocked off. Then they had to go to another attack, and all these attacks were coming from different countries. But it got to be the point where it was more expensive. And some of the accounts that I have on my site, uh, actually all of the accounts I have on that site, require two-factor authentication. So even after, if they could guess what the username and password was, they still had to have the token to put in, or they still had to have the biometric to use. And they didn't. And that's something a bot cannot do. That is where a human has to get involved. So you're raising the cost of the attack if you slow them down and a person has to intervene on every attempt to log into your site. So after one door with the user name and password, there was another door with the authentication code. And the bots can't handle that. They don't know how to generate those codes. They don't know where to look for those codes. And that means a person has to go in there and do an evaluation. The same thing is true with CAPTCHA, where they show you those ugly, grainy photos. Well, they're too low quality for a bot to try and use an image processor on, but the human eye is much more powerful. And it can say, okay, this is a bicycle, this is a bicycle, this is a bicycle, check the box. Even something simple that Cloudflare does, and is also is somewhat of a security service, where you may have seen it says, there's a little box, check here to indicate you're a human. It's because the bots can't do that. If a human has to intervene with every login attempt, that raises the cost and it makes your site less desirable. Remember, they don't want to put up a big fight in most cases to get into your site. They just want to take it over and do what they want to do. If they're trying to specifically to break into your site, as was happening to me, then they've got something else in mind that they want, because if they're targeting you, well, that's another thing I like about Cloudflare. They've got a little switch where you say, I'm under attack, and then they put on more security. It's like before they even get to your site, there's a page indicating steps where you have to indicate you're a human. Also on Cloudways, my host, I'm eliminating a lot of bots. There's pros and cons to that. You might also block off some bots that you want. So for example, sites like Ahrefs, it's a bot. It comes to crawl your site. They allow known and kind of approved bots. So the Google bot for Google Analytics can come through. Probably the Ahrefs one can come through, and some others. But all the other bots that are unknown and unidentified, they just block those right out. So they don't even get to my site. They get an error before they get in. Use a secure hosting provider. When I say secure, I mean that you have to provide some security before you even get into your own account. And again, you should not only have your username and password, you should have two-factor authentication to get in, so your account becomes secure. But the other problem with a shared hosting in particular is if somebody screws up something and they break into a server, or they break into a website on the same shared server that might give them a level of authority or access above that website, that means they can see all of the other websites and they can get in from the back end of the server. I do not like or recommend shared hosting for anybody that wants to make sure they have a secure server. You want to make sure that you're the only one who is working on your server. And a virtual private server will do that for you, even though it's part of like a bigger server farm that goes in there. If they take over the operating system, well, at a high level, yeah, they can always get in. But somebody hacking into a website on Bluehost or WPX, yeah, they can kind of get into other people's stuff. But a virtual private server, they're not going to get into that because those are isolated containers. There are shared operating systems that have different containers, but the way that they operate in general is not as secure as a virtual private server, or if you're willing to spend the money, a dedicated hardware server. So use bot protection services. I mentioned both Cloudways and Cloudflare, which work perfectly well together, can help you eliminate those bots and get them out. Same thing with the web application firewall. They know what the malicious attackers are, and they'll reject them before they ever get in. And as I said, use a dedicated server, which is going to be hardware, or a VPS, a virtual private server, to avoid your insecure neighbors. And back up regularly, because nothing is perfect, but if you have backups, you can probably restore yourself to a place before the attack happened. And you may lose everything that you've worked on since then, but you won't lose everything you created before. And there's probably a lot more that you created before the attack than after the attack. Educate your users. Make sure that they understand how to use secure IDs and passwords. Make sure that they're not sharing their accounts with someone else. This is something I see on forums all the time. People say, "Hey, anybody want to go in, together on a shared account for Surfer SEO?" Is one I saw recently. Well, that's a violation of their terms, with certain exceptions that they have, but they've started doing things now too. They will send a one-time code to your email address because they realize, one, they're not getting as much revenue as they would by people using shared accounts. That's why Netflix is clamping down on people sharing their accounts. They can tell if somebody's coming in from this IP address and this IP address and they're working simultaneously. Well, that's not the same person. So educate your users on some basic security features. You want to isolate valuable data from low value data. And that's where I talked about if I had people log in to submit their support requests, I'm not going to put that on a site where I have much more valuable data. I'm going to create a separate site. People can use that to log in and submit a ticket, and that ticket can go to multiple sites. But I'm not going to have them where somebody hacks into that site. The most they're going to get is a list of names of people who are sending me support tickets. They're not going to get any of the valuable data I have on my regular site. So we talked about WordPress security plugins a little bit. I've used iThemes security. I got this as part of a bundle. They call it Toolkit. And it had access to a lot of their features and software. The only thing I liked about iThemes security was the biometric. They were the first ones to do it. Others will follow. But as of right now, they're the only ones who have it. The rest of the stuff wasn't really good. And the user interface was nice, but as far as actually protecting you from stuff, they left open a lot of doors. And I would not recommend iThemes security. Another one is called Sucuri, and this is more of a software as a service. No problems with Sucuri. It integrates with WP Rocket if you're using that. And the fact that it is a software as a service, which also Cloudflare is, means that they can protect you at a different level before someone gets to your website. And of course, they've got a plugin they put on your website to integrate the two of them. They have a solid reputation. I have not used them, so I'm not going to recommend them, but I'm also not going to warn you away from them like I would with iThemes security. Wordfence has a free version and a premium version. For most people, just enough to get started, the free version works very well. And it works great. It is one of my favorite plugins for WordPress that I recommend. And the difference between the free version and the premium version is that there's a 30-day gap from when known vulnerabilities are included in the premium version, and then 30 days later, they give them to the free version. So premium gets protection of things right away. If you're willing to take a chance for 30 days for known problems, then the free version will work. But the free version is doing a lot of other things for you. And I'd say that it is something that everybody ought to do. It's free, it's very effective, and you'll see who's attacking you. You'll see what country they come from, what IP address they come from. You'll see what username they're trying to attack. And you'll see some of the other types of attacks they do. It will let you lock down your site in some of the places that we've talked about. You can disable the XML-RPC and other things. So it is really a wonderful plugin. That's the one I'm going to recommend. If you're not going to go for Sucuri, which is a paid service, they don't have a free version. And I'm not going to say that Sucuri is bad. I'm just going to say I have experience with Wordfence. I like it. I recommend it. And if you want the paid version, there's no problem with that. It means you get even more protection immediately. Uh, One example with Wordfence lately, they send off a notice, and so does iThemes Security, about known vulnerabilities in plugins. So I got an email from Wordfence today, and it said there were 38 known plugins, 0 themes with vulnerabilities this week, and there were 45 known vulnerabilities. So that means some of the plugins had more than one vulnerability in them. And they'll give you a list, and they'll tell you, is there a known patch that you should upgrade to, or is there not a known patch? And which means perhaps you should remove that plugin from your site. And of course, that's a value call that you make. But iThemes Security did this weekly. Wordfence does this weekly. They'll let you know what's going on in the security world. And if you don't have a plugin like these things, you don't know what's going on unless you're taking the time to go out and monitor it. Every week, I get this email, and it lets me know, do I have one of the plugins on this list? In most cases, I don't. But every once in a while, I'll see one and say, oh, I know that plugin. Oh, I might have to do something, or I already got rid of it. I'm glad I did. Awareness helps you to protect your site. So let's talk about this in recap. We talked about why they attack us. We talked about some security concepts, and those concepts were to identify the attack surface, reduce the attack surface, harden the attack surface, and raise the cost of an attack. And then we specifically talked about each of those things in relationship to WordPress vulnerabilities and what you can do. And then we kind of just briefly went over some WordPress security plugins. And that's all I got to say about that. Hope this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Until then, I'll see you next Thursday.